couple of life changes that weren't my choice. I ended up getting rid of my business and falling into consulting. And where I fell, the initial falling was at the church. I ended up going on a mission trip. My wife passed away and everything fell apart. And when she died, she had a real heart for Zambia, so we were going to just take her insurance money from her death and give it to the ministry. And my kids convinced me that I should go build an orphanage in her name, not just send the money. So 2 months after she died, we put a team of 10 people together and went and built that. So I got really encouraged by the mission trip and came home, and my church said, you've got nothing going on in your life right now. Why don't you come and work at the church as our missions coordinator? So that's where I kind of got launched into the church world, having had a marketing company, and was able to combine the two, and here I am today. So I started on staff just helping out with the creative department and ended up working up to the role of an executive pastor. So I did just about everything in a 5-year, and we grew from, when I started attending, it was about 300 people. When I landed on staff, it was about 6, and today they run 3,000 to 3,500. So I got to live through a really huge growth spurt. And as Jeffrey alluded, we are part of the GROW network, which is part of the ARC network, and because of our explosive growth, we became somewhat of the poster child for that organization. So we started getting, hundreds of churches calling us, trying to figure out what we're doing. And our pastor was as busy as any pastor, and I was basically his front door. So I started fielding all the calls, and I would tell people, you're not going to be able to get through to the pastor, so why don't I help you? One thing led to another, and they would say, well, why don't you come? Next thing you know, I'm traveling around the country working with GROW churches to help them implement the GROW network information, which is, it's great to hear, it's harder to actually execute. These guys go to these conferences and come home and they get all blown up for this great change, but then trying to implement it is a real challenge. So that's why I do what I do. So I still do some corporate work, but I work with 5 churches right now, and I'm always looking for, small churches especially. Quite honestly, the bigger churches kind of set in their ways, and they're harder to move. I love working with small churches that are growing. And I put on here some quotes by Henry Blackaby. I'm a big Experiencing God fan. If you've never done it, I would highly recommend it. But Henry Blackaby talks about God's flow, and you don't have to make it up, it's happening. And that's why I get excited about working with churches, that the flow is here, and it is here. So all you got to do is step into it. And my job is to help just manage the growth. The growth is coming whether you want it or not. So my job is to just challenge the growth and make sure that, or challenge the structure, that we have a structure to build on. So if you flip over, you'll see some of the topics I just wanted to touch on. Another thing I see, and it's pretty typical of small churches, is 1 or 2 people are carrying a heavy load. And Jeffrey and I have met several times over the last few years, and I felt his burden. And I would challenge him that he doesn't have to carry it. And quite honestly, in a small church, you just assume you do. And but it doesn't matter how small you are. If you start with the right attitude and start delegating appropriately, you can grow without imploding, which is often what small church pastors do. They carry everything till they can't carry anything anymore, and then things go backwards before they go forward. So with some of the experiences he's had, he's ripe for delegation. So this is where I walked in. So again, the Holy Spirit is here and alive. It's just a matter of managing it. So and I just want to have everybody really get a mentality that even though there's the sanctuary is only this size right now, have a large church mentality. It sounds simple, but if you're gonna be a large church, you gotta think like a large church. So everything I do sometimes sounds a little bit too structured, but it's because I'm thinking big for you, and you all need to think big. And you have to translate that down to your team to think big. And it's not for big's sake, it's for the gospel says for us to go out and make disciples,
Absolutely.
right? And I drive through that neighborhood on my way here where they don't plow the roads, but you know, these apartment complexes are prime. That's a prime target. This church ought to be 5 times the size. You should be having 5 services, not 2. So it's here, it's just a matter of doing something with it. So the challenge is defining everybody's role, and everybody in this room has a role to play, and you have to define your role, and you have to define the roles for those below you. And what you need to do is really think of that as you would your job corporately. Make a job description, create expectations for yourself, work with your team to create expectations for them. We often take off our thinking hats when we're in church, especially as volunteers. We give people a break. Oh, you're on the volunteer. I know you've got a busy life at home. I know, but after you've given 3 excuses, you ask the ask, but I need you to do this. And what I do is, again, I grew up professionally in a church that just asked first. Instead of making an excuse, they just said, this is what we need, can you do it? And that changes everything. And knowing that, you know, if you're a church of yes or no, making your yes, yes, and your no, no, maybe goes out the window. Therefore, if you can't do something, you can say no. But if you say yes, excellent is the standard, therefore, we're gonna do it at a high level. So this starts with defining your role, making sure that you have your role documented, that it right down to how much time does it take you. And the reason you do that is because you want to replace yourself. The only way you're going to grow is if you replace yourself. And again, everybody below you has that same mentality. Everybody in this room should have number 2 that they're grooming. And if they don't, you have to. But how often do you get asked to do something and you don't want to raise your hand because it's not clearly defined? So if you guys clearly define what it is you're asking with the time expectation, you're going to get a lot more people going, okay, I can do that. And if it's too much, say, okay, what do we do to minimize it? We can break it into 2 positions if we need to. But, you know, this happens in the corporate world, but it doesn't happen in churches. And then we wonder why people get burnt out, hurt, frustrated. It's a cultural thing. You gotta stop the culture of complaining, and you've got to make it solution oriented. So anytime anybody on your team gets huffy, like, oh, I can't believe, you know, this happens every week. Okay, well, what do we do to stop it? We're going to make an adjustment. So what is it? What is it that we need to adjust? So, and then the other thing about defining your roles is also defining a measure of success, which normally is a metric of some sort. And metrics often you think that's a number. It doesn't have to be a number. It's just whatever it is you want to measure, and define success for each position. Define success for your team, define success for your position, and make sure it lines up with the pastor's, you know, vision for the church. And again, when you do all that, you've given the people the why, you've given them the reason for being. They know why they're doing what they're doing, instead of just, you know, going through another day and being frustrated. And then it's easier to challenge them when they are in that mode. So again, embracing that culture, oftentimes it's another thing I hear in churches, oh, another change. Or I hear a pastor going, yeah, John, we want to bring you in, but we just can't bring one more change. And I say, that's sad, because you ought to be a culture of change.
Yep.
So if you're not changing, you're going backwards.
Absolutely.
So when anybody goes, why do we have to change again? Because we're growing. Woohoo! You know, that's where we exist. So again, you guys have to infuse this culture into the teams. And you can't just minimize people's concerns, but you can take their complaints and turn them into solutions and shift the culture by saying, isn't this great? We're growing, we're changing. Hey guys, we're gonna make another change. Isn't that great?
Right.
It's not because we wanna change for change's sake. We don't have a choice. So, and then, like I said, you gotta pick your leaders. Who are they? So I put some questions on here that I'd like for you guys not to answer this second, but this is talking points for you guys here in this room, and then I'll give you as many copies if you want to transfer this down and ask the same questions of your team. If you can get your teams involved in this process, they'll own it. If you dictate to them, they might not own it. Some people want to be dictated to, but a lot of people want to be part of the process, and this gives them the opportunity, and it gives you the opportunity to hold them accountable. If I say to you, look, I remember I use the example as a parent with my kids. At a certain point, I started letting them make up their own punishments. And they were a lot harder on themselves than I would have been. And then when I had to implement a punishment, I go, gosh, I hate doing this, but this is what you said that I should do, so this is what I'm gonna do. And it was a win-win for me. I didn't have to be the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think I should do if you don't clean your room? Well, take this away, do that. Okay,
Sounds good.
I might not like that, but I'll do it. But you can do the same thing with your team if you get them to be involved in this, and then they're not accountable to whatever it was that they said they were going to do. You can easily call them on it. Where what we do in the normal church world and volunteers is we don't even call them on it because they're volunteers.
Right.
And we make excuses for them, and we're the ones frustrated, and they don't even know it they don't even know there's a problem half the time. So, and then part of the culture, some people would think it's critical, but I think it's a culture of feedback, where you build in constant feedback. Again, I just think about it. You make one change in your area a week, that's 52 changes in a year. So if you have that culture of change and a culture of feedback, you're not being critical. You're not looked at as critical. And what I have to do is, because everything I say, I've fallen into in the church. I've fallen into making excuses and not challenging people hard enough. So what I do is I build in feedback into my meetings. I'll just say, I'll share an extreme example. I work with a lot of the people I work with, especially pastors, are complete visionaries, and I'm the A type, get it done. So we're polar opposites, and God's just blessed me with a lot of clients that way too. And I have a particular client who I meet with every week, and on my agenda is, excuse my French, but what did I do to piss you off this week? Because I know I did something to frustrate him, and if I don't put that out there, we won't talk about it and we'll grow apart. But now he can go, you pushed me in that area, and you need to not do that so hard. And then I can say, and you were late for that meeting, and that makes me feel disrespected, and because my time is really critical, and I'm tightly scheduled. So we have those open dialogues, and I'm not mad at him, and he's not mad at me. Guaranteed. If we didn't have that, in a month I'd be so frustrated, and he'd be so frustrated, we wouldn't even know what we're frustrated about. So by building those kind of feedback tools into whatever meetings you have with your team, you got to force it. And when somebody goes, oh no, everything's great, say, well, no, but how come I heard you huffing and puffing in the lobby last week? That's not great. What was the deal? What was a problem that we could solve together? Well, let's solve whatever problem that was. Now, if you're going to go there, which I hope you do, don't ever leave it undone. That's going to crush this culture. You talk about this, and somebody says, I don't like this because of this, and I think we should do that. And you go, okay, great. You walk away and nothing happens. That person will say, this is phony. This is just talk. But if you go back and go, look, we implemented this, or we heard what you said, or no, we can't appreciate your feedback, but that's not going to work. Love to collaborate on some other solution, but that one won't work. Even that, again, will they'll embrace it. And people want to be part of change. They want to be part of growth. They don't want to be dictated. So again, getting them involved in the process is huge. So, and then lastly, just defining ownership. It's a big mantra of mine. It's a lot of times, and we all know corporately when we're in meetings how poorly meetings can be run, but a lot of times there's just not a definition of ownership on tasks, and defining what ownership means to you. Oftentimes I'll sit in a meeting and I'll hear somebody say, wouldn't it be nice if this happened? And everybody sits there and the meeting goes on, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, what happened to that? Was that a talking point? Did Jeffrey just want to throw something against the wall and see if it stuck, but he wasn't looking to give ownership? Or was that something that somebody really wanted to hand off and it just didn't get there? So you've got to really keep your eyes open for that when you meet with your teams. Make sure that it's clear, like this is the task. Who's gonna do it? Okay, you said Ken's gonna do it. She, now what? Oftentimes we leave it there. Okay, well, we got somebody to own it. Well, no, you didn't. I use the example of buying a used car. If you went and bought a car, you wouldn't say, okay, salesman, give me the key. I'm out of here. You'd have to ask questions. What kind of gas mileage does it get? You'd have 100 questions before you drove off on a car you owned. But in this kind of thing, a task, we go, yeah, I got it. No, we don't. We couldn't possibly have it. We haven't asked any questions. So you got to be aware of the transfer, the communication, that you are actually transferring it and not just talking out loud or thinking out loud. And you're saying, okay, do you have it? And if you do have it, you define the next step and you define the deliverable date. So I need you to do this. You're going to ask questions. I know you have it, and now I'm not going to let you go until we just say, okay, what's next? It may be this big thing that's going to take 2 months to do, but what's next? Well, what's next is I do this little piece, and I'll have that for you next week. And then that keeps meetings productive. People get excited about being at meetings because they see movement. They see this big change up here filter down into these little communication changes, and then they're okay with the big change because they feel like they're being honored and respected in it. So now you can ask me to do anything because the system's so clean that I know I'm not going to bite off more than I can chew. And if I do, you as leaders care enough about me to pull me aside and go, look, this is more than I think you can handle. And don't be afraid to say no, and don't be afraid to stop something. If God wants you to do it, He'll provide the people. If you got to beg people to do something, you got to question whether it's even needed. Because a lot of times churches just do stuff to do stuff, and that's not smart. So that's my little talk.